And a couple of housekeeping items. Next week, our speaker is Shane Williams from Alachua County, and he's going to talk to us about local. Today, we're looking at a broad general overview of geoengineering. I'm going to give a very warm introduction to Dr. Mulkey in a moment. Also, Dr. Sassaman, who got stuck on a murder trial last week, is doing a makeup session on Monday, August 31st. So I know Julianne will alert everybody to that, but you might want to make a note that there's a makeup on paleo humans and how they adjusted to climate change. So I am, as many of you know, a returning undergraduate student at UF as an auditing student. UF has this amazing program where you can go for free if you can get professor permission. And I am a groupie of Dr. Stephen Mulkey's. I say that in all sincerity because I have taken every class he has to offer. I want to introduce you to our speaker. He began his career as a researcher and an ecologist climbing trees in the Amazon and Panama. During and after earning his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater, he spent over 20 years as a tropical forest ecologist affiliated with the Smithsonian. He is now an amazing scholar, an environmental scientist, and a researcher, and he is dedicated to building society's capacity for environmental mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, and he does that by being one of the most detailed and exquisite professors I've ever had the pleasure of studying under. I have been his student and fan, as I mentioned, since 2020. So besides tree climbing, Dr. Mulkey also climbed the corporate ladder. He was president of Unity College in Unity, Maine from 2011 through 2015. His vision resulted in Unity College being the first college in the United States to divest its endowment from the top 200 fossil fuel companies, and the first college in the US to adopt sustainable science as the framework for all academic programming. Dr. Mulkey has served as tenured faculty at 3 doctoral granting universities, as a science advisor to the state of Florida, probably couldn't get in there now, and as a program officer at the National Science Foundation. UF is lucky to have him settle here in Gainesville, and we at OCAMIC are fortunate to have him spend an hour with us looking at what geoengineering can mean for the climate. Please join me in a warm OCAMIC welcome to Dr. Stephen Mulkey.
Well, as always, Ellen, you're much too gracious. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Being here, thank you so much. Okay, how's that? Yeah, thank you, Ellen. That was really a gracious introduction. What I want to talk about today is tech-based geoengineering, using technology. A lot of people are convinced, naively I think, that it will save us. That's just simply not the case. And I am not going to give a neutral talk about that. I'm going to show you all the warts. I'm going to show you what's desperately wrong about investing huge amounts of money in.
Hold that to your mouth, or else move it more in front.
How's that? Yeah, huge amounts of money in technology-based management of the climate system. Gee, what could go wrong, right? So there are many, many aspects of it that involve a lot of technology and a lot of engineering and a lot of climatology. I'm going to give you a broad brush overview. I'm not going to talk about natural removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I'll start out by saying that carbon dioxide is our lever in terms of managing the atmospheric warming that's going on. And that's been true for 3.4 billion years. Carbon dioxide has always been the primary driver of climate. However, it remains today the only greenhouse gas that we typically emit. Some of them are far more powerful than carbon dioxide, but this is the only one that we can remove through either natural or technological processes. Natural processes, of course, involve this thing that is known as photosynthesis. I'll never forget when I was a stringer for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I was in Senator Bill Nelson's office talking to his aides, and about 10 minutes into my discussion, I realized that they did not know that carbon dioxide is taken up by the process of photosynthesis. So we had to back way up and have a discussion about the carbon balance of the planet Earth. So the main point here is that this is what's being focused on, both in terms of using natural forces and also using technology. So I have a whole series that I do on the natural removal and the games that are played with, the shell games that are played with forest credits, and that's rife for corruption and has been terribly misused. Anytime you see a corporate entity that says they're offsetting their carbon emissions, run. It's just not true. We do not have. It's very, very complex to use forest for offsets. They work, but they're very difficult to manage, and it requires considerable effort. Technology, on the other hand, seems to be what everybody's raving about. President Trump famously said, "Oh, we'll just fix the climate I think he was referring to sunlight interception. He said, well, we'll just cool it off with sunlight interception. I'm going to talk about that. It's gee, what could go wrong, right? So let's proceed. If you could give me the first slide. Please forgive me if I sound terribly arrogant. So some lights there. Thank you. So this is a very old figure. It actually comes from World War II, and it refers to weather modification as a weapon. And somebody's replaced the caption and called it the climate change console. It's not far wrong. This is Ken Caldera at Stanford, and he said in 2009, I look at geoengineering as something to only consider if our backs were really up against the wall. Well, welcome to the future. Our backs are against the wall. We're out of time, and we're in big trouble. So, and I can elaborate that on that after the talk if you wish. I believe that we should be outlawing the production of devices that emit carbon dioxide. Oh, how I wish we had done that and that we do it soon. So these are the sun dimmers. This is David Keith and his group at Harvard. He has deep financial interests in solar interception using sulfate aerosols or various other means of depositing aerosols in the stratosphere. He also has deep financial interests in carbon capture, direct air capture with big iron, lots of chemicals and machines. And so I consider him to be compromised, but he gets a lot of press, and I'll show you that at one point he actually published a piece in Science in which he looked at all the ins and outs as a gesture of objectivity, but he is anything but. CCU is carbon capture and use, carbon capture and sequestration, CCS. It can also be CCUS. Carbon dioxide removal is CDR, frequently SRM, solar radiation management, and albedo modification. This is a highly educated crowd. Albedo in physics terms is essentially reflectance. So we modify the reflectance of the planet. Direct air capture, big iron to suck air. Of course, let me remind you that CO2 exists at 0.04% of the atmosphere. So it's a rare gas. And capturing with these big machines that would just suck it from the air is a very, very energy intensive process, obviously. So when I started my career at Penn in 1980, the accepted value was 0.03 parts per million. I calibrated my first infrared gas analyzer at or 0.03%, and I calibrated my first gas analyzer at 323 parts per million. Anybody tell me what the current value is of the atmosphere? What's that? 424. It's the most recent value from Mauna Loa, which is actually a pretty good universal value for the planet, out in the middle of the Pacific at the top of a mountain. So SAI is another version of SRM. It's stratospheric aerosol injection. We'll spend some time talking about this. The two most likely methods are to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and there's really two ways to do that. One is carbon capture and sequestration, which is typically done at the smokestack of a power plant. But it could be used after it's captured, and we'll talk about how it's being used. And the other one is direct air capture with the big iron that I was discussing. And of course, spoiler alert, there is no CCS or no DAC system that has ever worked even remotely as specified. So although technically we have some technology to do this, it's very ineffective. The other is to reduce solar radiation by increasing the Earth's albedo, SAI or SRM, with aerosols pumped into the stratosphere. And we'll talk about some of the limitations there. I'm going to go through some of the wild ideas in geoengineering very quickly. Space mirrors, aerosols into the stratosphere, we will talk about. Cloud seeding, we'll talk about that. Carbonate addition to the oceans, we'll talk about that. That actually, I'll briefly mention that. That's actually probably not too bad of an idea for controlling the acidification of the oceans. Quick reminder, the oceans are acidifying because of the bicarbonate reaction. The more CO2 we put into the air, the more hydrogen ion or acid is produced. So ocean fertilization, the ocean is a nutrient desert, so let's spread some iron filings around and make the phytoplankton bloom. Well, we'll talk about limitations on that. Then there's something called biochar, which has actually been practiced by indigenous peoples for millennia. So it's actually a fairly good way to sequester carbon in the ground. However, you have to do a lot of it to make much of a difference. And artificial trees is another word for direct air capture. And we'll talk about the artificial trees. And reflective crops, come on, we eat, right? How are we going to decide, well, we're only going to grow reflective crops over very large areas of the planet. So this is not reasonable. So let's first talk about solar radiation management. Two most viable methods are at the level of low clouds in the stratosphere. This turns out not to be accurate. The lower stratosphere is around 10 to 16 kilometers above the Earth. These sulfate aerosols or aerosol interception would need to be distributed at about 20 kilometers above the atmosphere. And then the other method is increasing the reflectivity of marine clouds with cloud seeding. These are ship tracks off of western US, and that's the concept behind cloud seeding. And this is, we increase the reflectivity of the clouds over the ocean, less sunlight hits the surface, and warming is avoided. What are the side effects? There are many, many side effects. This is a device that appears in now textbooks. It does not exist. It's a way of cloud albedo reflectance modification by injecting sea salt, cloud condensation nuclei into marine stratus clouds. This device doesn't exist. Even a prototype of this device does not exist. Yet, naturally, politicians will look at this and go, yeah, let's do that. Okay, so SRM with stratospheric aerosols will change precipitation, and we have a big natural experiment. Mount Pinatubo was really useful in a number of ways. First of all, it validated the early climate models. Brian Soden, who became a leading climatologist at the University of Miami. At that time was at the Geofluid Dynamics Laboratory at Princeton, used the natural experiment of the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, which pumped enormous amounts of aerosol into the stratosphere, to demonstrate that the climate models that didn't have water vapor included did not accurately predict the cooling of the planet in the subsequent 3 years. But his model did within 1/10 of a degree. And so that was a huge advance. One of the things that happens is the continental discharge goes down, so there's less runoff and less land precipitation. This is because of blocking by the ash, by stratospheric injection of the aerosols by Mount Pinatubo. So obviously precipitation is going to change if we do this. So modeled engineer worlds are generally drier than pre-industrial at the beginning before they are modified. And then if we add 1.84% solar reduction from sulfate aerosols, we end up with a much drier world. This actually is closer to what we currently have, although precipitation is increasing. So very brief lesson in physics. So for every degree increase in the atmospheric temperature global average relative to pre-industrial, it can hold 7% more water vapor. That means it has more sucking power. It can dry out the land. So droughts, intense droughts, in fact, what we call now flash droughts, are more common. But it also means that all that energy aloft has to go someplace. And so as people in Vermont, what just happened? And that's exactly what we project for the upper Midwest and New England is intense rainfall. The climate models are very consistent about that. So reduced temperatures over tropical oceans, decreased in evaporation, decreased in precipitation. What about crops? Well, two natural experiments occurred. One was El Chichon and the other one was Pinatubo. And you can see down here the global average yield. Chichon didn't do that much except to maize. But if we look at the impact of Pinatubo, maize, soy, and rice were all severely affected. And this is associated with big reductions in precipitation. Well, the other thing that these things do is they open up the ozone hole. So right now, what we have is an ozone hole in the Antarctic that we are now controlling through the Montreal Protocol that went into law, international law in 1989. But we don't have only a thinning in the Arctic and other places in the world, but with sulfate aerosols, it provides surfaces for chemical reactions leading to ozone loss. And so the Montreal Protocol has banned the chlorofluorocarbons that cause the ozone hole. Many of you, I'm sure, if you think back, will remember the news on that. Sulfate aerosols could cause substantial increase in Arctic ozone depletion, especially during cold winters, and we will end up with stratospheric ozone depletion in Antarctica as well. So the cold poles of the Earth are where we have the ozone depletion most, but sulfate aerosols are capable of reversing. It will result in a 30 to 70 year delay in the recovery. So there's something called termination shock. So if you start spreading sulfate aerosols or calcite aerosols or something like that into the stratosphere, what if you quit all of a sudden? What would happen? And why might you quit? Can you envision a scenario where you would stop doing that? Well, I can, many scenarios, including terrorism, including change in political affiliations in the major industrial powers, especially the United States, which per capita is the largest polluter in the world. Well, termination shock is the rate of warming would immediately, very quickly, assume the background warming driven by the greenhouse gases. So what does that mean? Well, unless you're removing the greenhouse gases as you spread these aerosols, if it stops, you're going to immediately get very, very hot, and the planet's going to be in serious trouble, not unlike what it is now. Global mean precipitation is more complex following rapid cessation. Almost half of land areas would experience drying trends upon cessation, and the risk of abrupt and dangerous warming can be diminished only through concurrent strong reductions in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, obviously. So SRM does not reduce ocean acidification. So you modify the temperature, everybody's happier because it's not as hot. We'll talk about, obviously, there's a danger to crops, et cetera, but if you're continuing to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you end up with continued ocean acidification. So this is the normal situation or the abnormal situation we've created. And let's say we use sulfate aerosol atmospheric interception of sunlight, and we still have that acidification as indicated by the change in the pH. So this is really, really devastating for calcareous organisms. Can anybody think of a calcareous organism that lives in the ocean? There are millions of species that are reliant on that bicarbonate reaction as part of the carbon cycle of the planet. If SRM is used, it's essentially reduce and manage emissions from fossil fuels in the biosphere. The biosphere itself, in many places, has now flipped into being a carbon source rather than a carbon sink. And that's because we've changed the climate. The southern and southeastern Amazon in particular are in serious trouble. I'm 70. I anticipate that within my lifetime, most of the Amazon, especially in the south, will flip. And this is devastating for climate. It's devastating for the planet. It will be a positive feedback on the climate system that is forcing it to higher temperatures. That's terrifying news. As an ecologist who's been in the tropics, been in that forest, follows it closely in the peer-reviewed literature, that is not hyperbole, what I just told you. It's reality. And it's called a regime shift or a tipping point, and we are rapidly approaching that tipping point in the Amazon. So some of the possible ecological effects, not to mention agricultural effects, just look around the various living portions of the planet. Sulfate stratospheric interception induces influences on terrestrial ecosystems occur heterogeneously over the land surface and differ among ecosystem functions depending on location. So there's extreme heterogeneity in how this would influence living systems. Its global effects on ecosystems are mostly unknown, likely numerous, and what we've found so far is they're very negative. So they're not positive effects. Stratospheric injection of aerosols could be used under emergency conditions or as a stopgap until atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are reduced. Well, gee, maybe. But why would we go there to begin with? The first thing you do is you kill fossil emissions. You kill them. Full stop, period. Very little negotiation, and you do it as fast as possible. And guess what? Civilization is going to have to suck that up. That's my opinion. It's just what we're facing. That's the reality. So if you were to kill fossil emissions, the real question then is, must we still remove CO2 from the atmosphere? And the answer is yes, we must. But there's a way to do that that's been on the planet for over 3 billion years. We call it photosynthesis. So if we manage the biosphere properly so that it isn't a source, but instead we manage it for maximum sink capacity, again, spoiler alert, I see no need to be investing in big iron and the tech that requires a lot of fossil carbon right now just to build it. So Okay, so SRM, Danger of Climate Displacement and Fragmentation. This is a landmark paper from Trisos et al. In 2018. This is what the fragmentation of the ecosystems of the terrestrial Earth would look like if SRM were suddenly ceased. But it's fragmented in the process of getting there. So pushing this stuff into the atmosphere causes very heterogeneous effects. So species must either adapt or move to track shifting climates during and after SRM. The problem, of course, for agriculture is manifold. How do you manage agriculture for these unknown effects, especially for various regions of the world? Well, David Keith is determined to find a way. So they published a paper looking at half-strength SRM. Rather than restoring temperatures completely, SRM is applied to halve the warming produced by doubling of CO2. By the way, we will double CO2 relative to pre-industrial sometime in the late 2050s at current rates of emissions. In this model, half SRM offsets more of the CO2-induced increase in tropical cyclone intensity. In the model, temperature, water availability, extreme temperatures, and precipitation are not exacerbated. There is no validation in this modeling. The published results are from a group that is committed to this approach. There have been no follow-up papers that ask the question, how good is this model? How have it really been tested? So all National Academy studies to date state that SRM is not ready for prime time. And while we should avoid it, we should also study it. So everybody's talking about studying it. In fact, Biden just said that late last week. We should study this. Well, we've been studying it now for 15 years. So this is David Keith looking as though he's, I don't like David Keith, I apologize, looking as though he's being objective. He lays out the things that need to be clarified. The physical risks, some of which I've mentioned, the moral hazard is profound. So the industrialized nations decide to geoengineer the stratosphere. What are the implications of that for Africa, or for India, for crops in India, for crops in Africa, for the forest in South America, for the Pantanal, for the grasslands, for the Cerrado? The simple answer is we don't know. You've got one Earth, and you're about to run an incredible experiment with it. We're already running an experiment with it through the emissions that we've unwittingly put into the air. By the way, humans are not evil or stupid. We did what any obligately social primate would do with the powers that we developed through collective intelligence. We found an energy source deep in the ground, we mined it, we burned it, and we created a civilization. Many would argue that civilization is deeply flawed, but nonetheless, it is magnificent. It's a huge accomplishment for a species on planet Earth. Is there a different way we can live? There better be. So, yeah, I think so. So injustice, conflict, malevolent use, weaponizing of it, and Earth becomes more of an artifact. So you start to geoengineer the atmosphere, you start to geoengineer other parts of the planet, and where do you stop? Are we willing to essentially do that in perpetuity in order to maintain our... So summary of SRM risks. There are manifold, poorly understood risks of solar engineering, stratospheric ozone depletion, altered, mostly reduced precipitation in places where you need it, continued acidification of the ocean, impacts on crops and net productivity, danger of abrupt cessation or sabotage, changes in ocean circulation, which I haven't even talked about, but they could be quite profound, changes in sea ice. Alan Robach at Rutgers University said the main findings are that any implementation of stratospheric geoengineering could end catastrophically for many species. Although if geoengineering were ever done, it would not make sense to abruptly end it. There are credible scenarios where this might happen. Should society ever take that risk? Of course, my answer is no. So the most likely killer objection to stratospheric solar radiation modification is we have no economic means of ongoing injection of aerosols at 20 to 25 kilometers of altitude. No existing aircraft is suitable for this purpose. Platforms can be engineered, mainly balloons, but at great expense. Without injection at 20 to 25 kilometers, which is 12 to 16 miles above the Earth, coverage would not be sufficiently uniform to avoid fragmented effects. You still got effects on precipitation, acidification, et cetera, but nonetheless, we don't have the technology to get it up there in any efficient or economically viable fashion. So carbon dioxide removal takes many forms. Ocean fertilization, iron added to the ocean beefs up the phytoplankton. Ocean alkalinity addition, where you accelerate the chemical weathering of rocks on the Earth. There's a way to do that that would improve soil fertility and at the same time allow those crushed up rocks to be used to reduce the acidification of the ocean. And it turns out through the bicarbonate reaction that sucks up CO2. This is a promising area that a lot of people are looking at right now. The problem is cost. Manufacturing carbonate minerals using silicate rocks and CO2 from the air, extremely expensive. First, you have to capture the CO2, direct air capture, artificial trees, essentially, and then putting it in a geological strata. There's something called biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. The way that works is you grow a bunch of trees as a crop, you burn them in your power plant, and then you capture the CO2 at the smokestack, and you keep doing that cycle. Well, the problem is that if you don't capture the CO2 at the smokestack and you burn the trees faster than photosynthesis captures it naturally, then you don't get any drawdown, and you actually end up increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere in the short run. So this is probably not a viable strategy because the crops that we would use for biomass energy would compete with land for food and other purposes like fiber. Afforestation and reforestation.
Mute means I can hear.
What's that?
I'm sorry, we just interrupted you. We're testing this. I'm very sorry.
Okay, no worries. So afforestation and reforestation, I think that's our best bet, but it needs to be done by experts, and we need legions of eco-managers, kind of like the Public Works Administration under FDR. Not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world. We need those people, and we have those people. Many, many young people are totally invested in this. I don't have to convince any of my students that climate change is real, it's urgent, and incredibly dangerous. They are scared, and they should be scared. They just don't know what's actually happening and what can be done about it. So I tell them right out of the gate that we're in big trouble, but we have all the tools we need, both technology and policy-wise. They're all there. So we can talk more about that. At any rate, okay, I'm not advancing. So let's talk about carbon dioxide removal. First, let's talk about fertilizing the nutrient desert that is the oceans. So most of the photosynthesis in the oceans happens in the Arctic, and it happens near the coastlines because that's where the nutrients are. So let's add, still not working. No. I've got one. You want to use mine? Oh, okay. Okay, now we're good. Productivity is limited by mineral nutrients for photosynthesis by phytoplankton. Well, this is businessman Rush George, and he said, well, heck with this stuff. I can solve this problem. I'm going to spread a whole bunch of iron into the ocean. So, but he forgot something called the carbon pump. The carbon pump is where carbon dioxide is fixed by phytoplankton, but is passed on to zooplankton, but the phytoplankton die, and particulate organic carbon, bacterial respiration, all of these organisms respire, and the CO2 then comes back out. So there's generally a balance in the system. However, there is some that makes it all the way to organic carbon burial in the ocean bottom, but it's a very ineffective way to control CO2 concentration. Iron is the usual candidate. Small-scale field experiments show that maximum benefits are really modest, not really in the range of what we need to do. Turnover of organic mass, biomass, increased respiration and CO2 release. Well, so he went ahead and under the flag of indigenous peoples, which did not agree to this, he went and dumped a whole bunch of iron into the ocean off the west coast of Canada, and there was international outrage. And I think he found himself in court by the indigenous peoples whose name he'd usurped. Farming with rocks. So if we spread a whole bunch of crushed up rocks onto croplands, it improves their soil conditions and can support crop production. Silicate rocks are the way that nature normally takes CO2 out of the air. It's that weathering process, slow trickle of very slightly acidic rainfall that weathers the rocks and sucks CO2 out of the air. It's a major component of the carbon cycle. So let's speed it up. Globally, silicate weathering removes about 2.5% of fossil CO2 emissions every year, doubling that rate by adding ground silicate rock to all the soils in the world would provide an additional incremental sink of about 2%. This would improve soil fertility, but be very expensive, as much as $900 per ton of carbon, and require energy from fossil emissions to crush the rock. So what's the payback period? Well, enhanced weathering could be used to maintain the ocean pH and offset acidification. And it also can interact with the bicarbonate reaction, taking more CO2 out of the air and shifting the balance toward removing that CO2. There's a lot of interest in this right now. Well, Keith's group and others have developed direct air capture, hugely expensive to develop. They say the levelized cost, that is cradle to grave, of a ton of CO2 in this method is $94 to $232 per ton. Well, anything over about $100 per ton is probably not viable in terms of the financial markets. This is simply wrong. The present cost to develop direct air capture is more than $800 per ton. Shown on the left is the basis of his direct air capture calculations, and it's about the size of your garage. There are bigger ones that are being developed and have been developed, but they are not making any difference to speak of. Very, very tiny removal of CO2, and it took a lot of fossil carbon to build it. Look at all that steel. This thing, people show this all the time as if, well, look at this. Well, that's an artist's rendition. That's not real. It doesn't exist. This does exist, and it's really is flawed in terms of being used to scale up the costs. So carbon capture use and sequestration, big plans and big money. These are the carbon capture projects in the US and in Europe and in the Middle East. And you can see there are lots of them. And in the US, there are 89 direct air capture and carbon capture and sequestration projects under development. All require public subsidies to function or to get off the ground. Over $12 billion has been allocated in the 2021 Infrastructure Act, and about 40 billion more has been allocated in the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Biden administration is investing in this. I think it's flawed in terms of what we should be doing. No carbon capture sequestration project on Earth or DAC project on Earth has been even a marginal success according to its engineering specs. It just hasn't worked. This is the Kemper Carbon Capture and Sequestration Project in Mississippi. It failed utterly in its design. It was decommissioned and simply imploded. There's an amazing video of this plant being blown up in 2021. Carbon capture and sequestration resulting from coal, fossil gas. By the way, I don't call it natural gas. It's fossil gas, or if you wish, fossil fuel, that it's not natural, and biomass burning. So carbon capture and sequestration uses chemical amines or hydroxyl, large quantities, to strip the CO2 from power plant emissions. None have met targets and none have functioned as designed. The projects in Australia were heavily publicly subsidized and they failed utterly. So how much chemical would you have to use? The answer is a lot. Can it be salvaged after you use it? Well, you drive the CO2 off and you capture it. You can regenerate 90% of the chemical activity in those chemicals again, but takes a lot of energy to do that. So 5 industry sectors could be affected by this: chemical production, hydrogen production. We can talk about hydrogen later if you want. It's not a viable option for the vast majority of energy uses. Fertilizer production, fossil gas burning, and power generation. Sequestration can be deep in geological strata or deep in the ocean. So here's some places on Earth, the terrestrial Earth, where you could sink it. Here are places in the ocean where you can form a CO2 lake deep, and it will sit down there for millennia, literally thousands of years. And but there's something called enhanced oil recovery. So this is the typical sequence of the history of an oil well. You've got the primary production, the gusher. Then you have secondary production, which is generally fracking, horizontal forcing of the air of the oil using chemicals and treated water to go into the fractures, hence fracking. And then you got tertiary production. Notice that the peaks are smaller at every iteration. And tertiary production is enhanced oil recovery using captured CO2 and water. So essentially, it pulls every last drop of oil out of a well. So is it being used? Well, here's the scheme for EOR operation. You've got an injection well, and then you've got the production well. No big science there, but this is a big project that was the Chute Creek project, lifetime CO2 capture and performance. I believe it was in Montana. 97% of the CO2 has been vented or sold for enhanced oil recovery. In fact, enhanced oil recovery is the only large-scale viable market for captured CO2, if you want to put it in market terms. So this comes from Bloomberg. Right now, in 2021, enhanced oil recovery was the use of 73% of captured CO2. They said that by 2030, it would be down to 20%. Well, I'll challenge that in a minute with the peer-reviewed literature. But Bloomberg themselves say this will not save the fossil fuel industry. Carbon capture and sequestration will not compete well with carbon-free alternatives for power production or transportation. Obviously, the required energy is enormous. It may help decarbonizing the final 5 to 10% needed to get to net zero. Direct air capture is massively inefficient and incredibly expensive, and it takes a lot of fossil fuel to initiate it. So, well, is Bloomberg right? Well, yeah, enhanced oil recovery will become less of a proportion of the CO2 storage, but it still is a very, very large amount by 2035. So I don't think Bloomberg's forecasts are useful. So this is a site in Washington of the W.A. Parish coal plant in Thompson's, Texas. What we've got here are different amounts, different processes generating social costs associated with carbon emissions. So social costs are monetized deleterious effects of emissions. Believe it or not, all of the models have in them something called the social cost of carbon, which is the cost of removing 1 ton of CO2, or the cost of adding 1 additional ton of CO2 to the atmosphere versus the benefit of burning that coal or that gas or whatever. So is cost benefit a function an appropriate way to look at this issue? I suggest you think about that. So synthetic direct air capture and use, the mean estimate of social costs per unit electricity over 20 years is what's shown in these graphs. The blue is the cost of the equipment and the carbon emissions from that. The brown is the air pollution costs. These are costs that are not ever included really in the cost benefit analysis, but we should be worried deeply about those. And the black is the 20-year climate cost. So if you run the thing for 20 years, you can see that wind only is the hands down winner, but note there is a social cost to creating wind turbines. So they're not completely carbon free, but over their lifetime of more than 20 years, certainly, they become carbon free. So wind, water, and solar generators, they eliminate non-CO2 air pollutants from fossil combustion. They eliminate upstream mining, transport, and refining of fossil fuels and the corresponding emissions. They reduce pipeline, refinery, gas station, tanker truck, oil tanker, and coal train infrastructure. Reduce oil spills, oil fires, gas leaks, and gas explosions. We don't go to war to capture the sun's energy or the wind's energy. Reduce large-scale blackout risk associated with centralized power plants by decentralizing and distributing power production. Well, Texas lost a whole bunch of power during a deep freeze a couple of years ago. Well, the thing that's keeping people cool in Texas right now is wind and solar. And they blamed wind and solar for the failure is actually freeze up of their fossil gas system that did that. So the biggest bang for the buck comes from wind and solar. Bioenergy carbon capture is expensive and gives only modest results after consideration of land use, that should be. Carbon capture and sequestration is very expensive, results in very low mitigation. So let's look at the numbers. You can see that if it's blue, essentially it pays that much of its costs. So wind and solar have very low costs. Bioelectricity, extremely expensive, and fossil carbon capture and storage, extremely expensive. The management of ecosystems all has cost to it, but the bang in terms of potential reduction is very, very high. So we can do this, and we can afford to do it. If we look at transportation, fuel efficiency, electric vehicles, et cetera, public transport and bicycling, something I highly recommend. I'll just boast for a minute. I have a 2014 Prius, and I fill it up once every 6 weeks to 2 months. It's a 10-gallon tank, and I commute to my office 10 miles and back 10 miles on an electric bike. And I highly recommend it. I get exercise. The main limitation of doing that is the heat, but if you're moving and you have plenty of fluids, you will evaporatively cool. So, summary of tech-based CDR risks. Issues with CCS, BECS, and DAC include capacity for transport and storage has not been demonstrated. No project to date has been a success. There are competing needs for land for the biomass. DAC will require huge investments in industrial material resources to implement at scale. How many of these things are you going to build around the world? How much iron will be required? How much carbon, fossil carbon will be required? The implementation phase of DAC will occur, large carbon costs to build. The carbon payback period is unknowable, perhaps, certainly unknown, but could be very long. Reliance on DAC and CCUS assumes deployment at scale and time to make a difference. Carbon capture use and sequestration and EOR permit social and health costs of carbon extraction to continue. If we kill fossil emissions and manage the biosphere to remove CO2 and reduce positive feedbacks, will we still need some form of tech-based CCS to stabilize the climate? My answer is no, we won't. But we need to get really busy managing the living portion of this planet. We know how, we have the skills, and we need to invest deeply in doing that instead of investing all of the big iron and tax dollars and what it would take to implement DAC at scale or retrofit all the coal plants. Get rid of the coal plants, kill them as fast as possible. So I know that sounds outrageous to us. We're sitting here in an air-conditioned space, lighted the whole 9 yards from fossil fuels. The Deerhaven plant has a biomass component. They say it's waste wood only. First of all, there are ecological issues with using waste wood in terms of the scale over which that carbon would be released versus burning it. Secondly, I don't believe them. I don't think it's waste wood. I think they're bringing pellets in or farm trees. So I want to see an audit. I want to know where the wood's coming from. So most economic analyses conclude that geoengineering will result in diminished efforts at mitigation, i.e. stopping fossil fuels, once temperature is controlled. Geoengineering options must be seen as part of a portfolio of strategies and not lead to weakened efforts. These tech solutions should be used only as a last resort. And this is Mark Jacobson, who's one of the giants, I think, in alternative energy. He's at Stanford. He says geoengineering, such as adding aerosols to the stratosphere or the marine layer to reflect more sunlight, is not a way to solve any problem. Its goal is to temporarily mask some increase in temperatures, but by allowing fossil fuel and bioenergy combustion to continue, it provokes more emissions and more warming than it offsets, while killing even more people and creating more mining devastation due to the increase in fossil production in particular. So he has a lot to say. He's got a solutions project at Stanford run by his students, and it's really impressive. He's developed solutions for 134 countries and every state in the union, including in the United States, including Florida. This was in the Lancet Planetary Health, arguing that we need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. We needed that like 15, 20 years ago. Non-proliferation, don't add to the problem, stop digging when you're in a hole. Fair phase out, I agree with that, but it has to be done fast. And just transition, accelerate an equitable transition, increase access to renewable energy and lower carbon solutions for the global south. Obviously, we don't include Australia and New Zealand in that. This is what should be in a non-proliferation treaty. I want to introduce you to Greg Taylor. He's a Sydney man that has set an ambitious target to phase out his alcohol consumptions within the next 28 years as part of an impressive plan to improve his health. This program will see Greg, who's 73, continue to drink as normal before reducing consumption in 2049 when he turns 101. Taylor said it was important not to rush the process. It's not realistic to transition to zero alcohol overnight. This requires a phased approach. He said that adding that, whiskey drinkers are the real problem. Greg is lobbying for additional investments in beer to maintain the beer supply chain. Greg will be able to bring forward drinking credits earned from the days he hasn't drunk over the last 40 years, enabled him to reach net zero but keep drinking. To assist in the transition, he has bought a second beer fridge, which he describes as capture and storage. He is also investing in direct alcohol extraction from the blood technology. My point is made. So, what is the single most important driver of Earth system disruption and climate change? Well, that's a very general answer. Let's get more specific. CO2, that's still very general. Burning fossil fuels is the obvious answer. I've got a different answer, guys. I think it's the media. Well, it turns out that population is an inaccurate statement, and there are many reasons why that's true, which I'll save for another time. But it has mainly to do with per capita consumption is the main flaw in that argument. The media, however, has been the engine of persuasion that's allowed our earth-destroying neoliberal capitalist system to persist. George Monbiot said that in the climate book, which is edited by Greta Thunberg. I actually post that book as strongly recommended reading for my new course on communities and climate change. Very accessible by a lay audience, very lay public, but it's got world-renowned experts contributing chapters all throughout. It's not just Greta Thunberg being an advocate and an activist. It's people like Michael Mann, the guy that discovered the hockey stick. It's many, many others like Alan Robach and many of the other climate scientists, hardcore card-carrying climate scientists have written in that book. It is an excellent review of climate change. I would recommend it to anybody. So thank you for your time. I hope this has been useful, and I hope you have not found me to be too bombastic.
Can we, a few questions?
I can stay as long as you want.
Okay,
so.
thank you.
I didn't follow iron for fertilizing the ocean.
Okay, fertilizing the ocean with iron filings. Remember you were in grade school? They gave you iron filings and a magnet to play with them. It's exactly the same substance that we're talking about. So the nutrient desert in the open ocean is mainly limited by macronutrients for photosynthesis, and iron is one of the primary limitations. So,
I'm sorry.
magnesium and other things are important, but iron is the limiting factor. And so adding iron really jacks up photosynthesis. That's about the extent of my knowledge of it. I know that the papers on fertilizing the ocean show that it basically doesn't work very well.
Well, you know, the hemoglobin molecule and the chlorophyll molecule are somewhat similar.
They are.
And,
They are.
You know, hemoglobin is iron and chlorophyll is magnesium. So,
Yeah.
I mean, is the iron important for a lot of the enzymes?
Yeah, iron is important for the reduction process of the two phases of photosynthesis, the light reactions and mainly the dark reactions. So there's plenty of light in the euphotic zone, although it's limiting. The main thing that's limiting in the euphotic zone turns out to be iron and a couple of other things, but iron is a primary driver.
I want to just add to that. In the previous course that we did a semester or so ago, we talked about whale poop can save the planet. And one of the reasons whale poop could save the planet is when they poop, it's iron and nitrogen. And they do, with their up and down in the water, they're circulating and feeding phytoplankton, which feeds the krill, which feeds the whales. So thank you.
I think blaming the media for as a source of our problems is dishonest
Okay.
because what appears in the media is the end result of a long process that begins with the writing of checks.
No,
If you would go into
agree
that
with you.
and maybe discuss the Heartland Institute,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, of course. I'm putting the media as the answer out there simply to be provocative.
And Nathan Crabb is going to be addressing us
Oh,
in 2
great.
weeks
Yeah.
from the invading
Nathan-
sea on
Nathan
the
is
impact of
incredible.
media and the intersection of media and climate change.
I have enormous
question.
respect for him and Cynthia Barnett here locally. If you can get Cynthia to talk, she would be terrific.
I'll get her phone number from you.
No, I actually don't have it, but you can find her email at UF. She's
Yeah.
I have a
she'd be
question
great.
here on Zoom. Let's bounce to Zoom. Go ahead, Pat.
Yes, this sort of relates to what I think that was Larry's comment. The only way I see of doing any of these, good, bad, or indifferent, is getting rid of all the politicians and the lobbyists. I mean, it's greed, obviously, that seems to run the world, and trying to get fertilizer producers and oil producers and all of those things to even agree to a little bit of this is almost impossible. I'm sure you're aware of, well, maybe not, our last legislative session, the governor banning fertilizer bans in order to reduce algae, which is another problem in killing our waters, but it's a similar thing. I mean, they cave into the lobbyists. So to me, politics is the biggest problem and greed.
Well, actually, I do agree with that. I think the media have been very instrumental, and that slide comes from a course that I teach that's got a lot of journalism students in it. I just want to punch them right in the nose and say, listen up, guys, you've got a moral obligation. You've got a job to do. But it is provocative, and I actually don't believe it. I think neoliberal model for economics and finance is really at the heart of, and I'm going to use this word very deliberately, the rape of our planet. That is really what's happened here. And, there's several different alternative economic models. One of them is called degrowth. That's catching a lot of attention in Europe, France and Spain in particular. I encourage you to look up degrowth. It is not a recession. It's managing throughput of energy and materials. And it's a very different approach to how we manage the global economy, macroeconomics.
Do you remember in our class, there was a video that was a debate between, do you remember the name of that?
Well, no, it was a debate.
Microphone.
It was a debate online about, it was a conference held between the major proponent of green growth and the major scholar of degrowth. And the scholar of degrowth just demolished the green growth concept. And I agree with that. Green growth is still growth, and we're out of running room. So I do agree with him.
Okay. Question here?
Speaking of whale poop, just last night, I just don't know if people are aware, on PBS, there's the 6-part series called Human Impact. The host is a scientist from Princeton. It's really, I think, very well done. And last night he talked about the effect of whales and whaling and krill. So it's on PBS, a 6-part series. If you have Passport, you can catch the first 3.
What kind of assumptions are built into your projections about the population? I mean, it's people. If we had less people, we'd have less problems, right?
Well, there's no question that that's true. But if you look at the consumption and the carbon production, it's almost entirely from the global north. And the US is now the third most populous nation on earth. There are several other issues with the population argument. And one of them is that the birth rate worldwide, with only 2 exceptions, has proceeded to decline, and in the vast majority of cases is below replacement rate. So what will we do with population at this point? Well, the answer is reduce consumption. We wouldn't really do much to control population growth because it's already in the process of diminishing. One of the problems with the demographic shift that's supposed to happen in industrialized nations is that it's predicated on better food, better medicine, all of those things. It turns out the single most important thing is empowering and educating women. And that's been shown again and again with several different studies now. The other thing that's been shown that I think is really important to realize is that to have a good life, and good life can be defined very specifically in a number of different ways, and there are different levels that you might consider a good life, but they are all far below the consumptive energy production that we currently live with, the material and energy flow. So many studies show that having a good life is not dependent upon the level of energy that we currently consume. Of course, the toxic part of that energy consumption is that it comes from fossil fuels.
Anyone on Zoom? Other hands? What? Okay, last 2 questions.
I just wanted a little clarification. I will make sure I understand that flip that you mentioned in southern Brazil. Is that because of deforestation, or is there something going on more subtle?
There are multiple things happening simultaneously in the Amazon basin. Many of them have to do with destruction of the forest itself. Most of the forest is being cut down not for timber or not for any major industrial use. It's being cut down for cattle and meat production. That's the vast majority of it. And so the problem is there's an additional added pressure to the Amazon basin, and that is the interconnections from the Arctic all the way down to Central and South America, mainly South America, is resulting in a drying. So the Amazon basin exists as this vast sea of about 6 different forest ecotypes, ecosystems rather, because of hydrology, because of the water vapor process. In parts of the basin, 70% of the precipitation comes from the plants themselves. Not that much actually is coming from offshore in the Atlantic, but the plants themselves are major contributors to the hydrology. So we're changing the plants in the southeastern region through vast damage to the forest mechanically and in other ways burning it, but also climate change itself is changing the hydrology. So as CO2, there are 2 things going on. As CO2 increases, stomata don't stay open as wide or as long because they reach they can gain carbon without losing water vapor. So that's what stomata are designed to do, is to manage water vapor loss through transpiration while fixing CO2 from the atmosphere. So we've increased the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere from 280 parts per million prior to the Industrial Revolution to 424 is the current number from Mauna Loa. So we will double the CO2 concentration relative to pre-industrial sometime in the late 2050s at the current rate. So CO2 itself is affecting the hydrology through the stomata that are the linchpin of the entire system, and also the atmosphere is drying out over the Amazon basin. Now, this has what we call teleconnections. It's actually going to affect the Western Antarctic ice sheet as the Amazon transforms, and it also is going to affect the Tibetan Plateau. So these are all known as tipping elements or tipping points or regime shifts beyond which we cannot recover in any conceivable human time frame. It's just, we're in a completely different planet. I would submit to you that we have already arrived in that completely different planet. So the world that my children, 35 and 27, my son and daughter respectively, the world that they're going to grow up in and what they will experience at my age will be a profoundly different place. And my grandson, August, is going to be in a very different planet. So how do we take care of those kids? That to me is the central question. I came back from NSF and probably should have just shut up and retired and rode my bicycle. But I realized that somebody needed to be teaching comprehensive floor-to-ceiling climate change to the undergraduates. So I now have 4 courses in my portfolio. Well, hallelujah, I'm such a great guy, but I'm tired, man. I mean, it's wearing me out. I need help, and I need, there's a group called Third Act that's run by Bill McKibben. If you don't belong to Third Act as an older person, you should, because that's where people like us who have some modicum of resources, academics accepted, can actually make a major contribution to the climate effort. There's also numerous groups now that have arisen. Fridays for Future from Greta Thunberg. All of these are young people groups. I now, in the course that I'm building for online delivery, communities and climate change, I include a section on activism and movements and civil disobedience. This could get me fired, but I'm absolutely going to review the acts of civil disobedience that are now happening and with increasing frequency around the world. There are groups who act only through civil disobedience. Am I advocating? No, I will not do that. But I want students to know what's out there, what's being done.
So you touched on, we have one last question, but I do want to just piggyback on what Dr. Mulkey just said. The reason we're offering Climate Conversations Amplified is so you talk about what you learned, keep the conversation going. Catherine Hale, who's a very wonderful climate scientist, says that is the best thing you can do above anything else, and get involved in groups like Third Act and also Elders Climate Action. So those are 2 groups that are free. You just join them. And the Elders Climate Action Group will give you a daily climate action now on your iPhone or your Android. Swipe left, do 5 quick emails or notes, and you feel like you're participating. Okay, Mallory, you'll be the last question.
I'm okay. I'm doing fine.
Frank is ceding to Mallory.
In the same spirit that Ellen was just talking about, I don't know if any of you know Ray Katz, K-A-T-Z. Does that name mean anything to any of you? Ray Katz writes for an online newsletter called Medium, and it has a lot of different kind of
I've published there
a lot of pro climate activists on it. And Ray has come up with he just said essentially the same thing in talking about we've got to get people out there. We are the ones who can make the change. Don't even look to politicians. Just
they're owned.
The people must stand up for their lives, essentially.
I just finished a book on cliodynamics. It's a mathematical review. It's kind of like the Asimov's Foundation. It has models in it, but this is a legitimate science. And it asks questions about how we got here. What are the primary factors? And one of the primary factors is an excess production of elites that want a seat at the big table, and hegemony of resources by the elites, and then immiseration by the 50% and lower. And so those two factors describe the United States and many other developed countries right now. And so he basically says scientifically, we meet the definition of a plutocracy in the United States. If you think we're a democracy, think again.
Well, Ray has started two organizations. One is called Earth Rebirth, and the other one is called Climate Declaration. So if you want to Google, either or both of those, you can get some information that he has put forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I think
Sure.
you should close with telling us about your blog, and then folks should write this down.
Oh, I've got a blog that I really need to contribute to more frequently. There's just not much on it right now. Recent. I've been keeping it since I became president of the college in Maine in 2011. I talk about divestment in many places on it. I've published pieces from that blog in Medium. I think there's two of the most recent entries are one's on geoengineering, and the other one is on the summary of the AR6, the synthesis report of assessment report number 6. And these are video presentations rather than actual written presentations. So I have a home studio that I record from these days, and it's called environmentalcentury.net. Environmental Century is one word. And I got that domain name many years ago, and so I've just kept it. It's kind of clunky. But I also have some opinions on there that many of you may disagree with, that you should take it with a grain of salt. But I think that, but I try to make everything science-based. So one of the things that happened to me at the National Science Foundation, which I think was really disturbing, was the division that I was in was HER, or HRE, Human Resources and Education. And so I was in the Graduate Education Division, and my job was to review grants that were submitted to the National Science Foundation for development of graduate training. I was prohibited from ever allowing the term climate change in the title to any of those grants or in the abstract, which is what the congressional aides would read. And so many of these grants were top dead center on climate change, and many of them got awarded. The award rate is 4%, so God, it's so hard. But the bottom line is that I allowed climate change and the word sustainability and sustainability science to go through in 3 of the proposals that I submitted for funding. And I was called into my unit director's office and yelled at. I was told, you are never to do that again, and if you do it again, we'll fire you. I was still on the probationary period. So it was a very unpleasant experience. When the Science March happened the same year, this was 2017, the first Trump administration year, me and many other scientists at NSF put on white coats and we went out and marched. And later, after it was over, I was formally reprimanded, told that I should not have done that. And the problem is that HRE gets a separate allocation from Congress rather than the general budget for the National Science Foundation. So groups like GEO and the ecology groups were all gung-ho about climate change. But HRE was terrified that the Republicans, which then dominated the House, would kill their funding. And so it all came downhill on people like me who were the program managers. And so I've had that experience numerous times. In 2007, in March of 2007, I gave an invited talk to a joint session of the Florida House and Senate on climate change and energy alternatives. About 3 or 4 minutes into my talk, Senator Kerry Baker rose from his seat. He's a senator from Eustis, Florida, and he called me a liar, a charlatan, and demanded that I be dismissed. And I was told to step down. So you could say that I lost my political virginity at that moment. And if my wife didn't have family here, I would be gone. And but anyway, she does, and I'm loyal. So I'm staying right here.
Well, you keep up the good work because we are listening and we are taking action. And you are an inspiration and an
I hope so.
extraordinarily knowledgeable speaker. So thank you very much.
All right. Sure.